Welcome, everyone, to our second in a row LinkedIn Live seminar, this one entitled Beyond the Reading Wars. We are turning our minds today to essentially the central promise of education the world over, that schools will teach children to read. And yet we find in so many communities that is not yet always the case. I'm excited to jump into this discussion and conversation. Before we do that, though, invite everyone to say hello on the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from today. We will be taking questions on the chat throughout the session, so really just invite everyone to be a part of this discussion. I am thrilled to have with me today two extraordinary speakers, Emily Hanford, Senior Producer and Correspondent for American Public Media, and Dr. Benjamin Piper, Director of Global Education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I am Caitlin Barron, the CEO of Luminos. Luminos is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children who've been kept out of school by conflict or poverty learn the foundational basics and unlock the world of reading. And we're here today to mark the launch of the second, the latest element in the Luminos method, phonics for first-generation readers. This is a distillation of everything we've learned at Luminos over the last better part of a decade on what it takes to help children who are the first in their families to learn to read, to unlock early literacy. And excited to invite all of you to take a look at all that online. So once again, we will be taking questions in the chat throughout the session. So please do invite everyone to jump in and be a part of this discussion. At Luminos, we wrote phonics for first generation readers, and we hosted this webinar because, quite honestly, back when we first launched our organization, we were not necessarily focused on phonics as fundamental to the journey of children in earlier learning. We knew it was a part of the story, but I wouldn't say that it was central to our approach. And the reason we're such strong believers in the centrality of a systemic and intentional approach to teaching through phonics is because we've seen through skillful classroom observation, through our external evidence and data, and through the broader body of emerging research that learning to read via phonics is fundamental to children everywhere, but especially the children whom we serve. So we work with students who are often the first in their family to learn to read, coming from homes that may not have a single book, and coming from environments where the printed word is not a familiar thing. Most importantly, many of the students we teach are actually learning to read in a language they don't speak at home. And so when you think through all of these like pretty extraordinary barriers to learning to read, it starts to become clear why a systematic step-by-step approach to teaching kids to learn to read is all the more essential. So turning now to our first speaker, welcome again, Emily. Many of you on the webinar may have had the pleasure of enjoying Emily's podcast, Sold a Story. There are now over 5 million people who've listened to this podcast. So really quite revolutionary in the world of education reporting. And a large part of the reason this podcast has really caught fire is I think that Emily has helped us understand in a new, refreshed way with a new sense of urgency exactly how important this topic is. So, Emily, just to help us sort of set the stage here a little bit today, can you describe, what is typically happening in American classrooms today when it comes to teaching children to read?
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm very happy to share what I've learned about what's happening in the United States and eager to learn more about what's happening in other parts of the world. I think this is a really fascinating conversation, so thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I didn't know anything about how schools in the US teach reading a few years ago. I have 2 kids who learn to read pretty easily, and I never really thought very much about how reading is taught. And then a few years ago, I started to meet a whole bunch of parents all over the country who had a very different experience. They did all the right things. They read tons of books to their kids. They encouraged reading. They did have lots of books in their homes. Their kids had lots of experience with print before going to school, but their kids still weren't learning how to read. And what I discovered is that a big part of the problem is they weren't being taught how to read in school, which is kind of a mind-blowing sentence to say, because I think everyone assumes here in the United States for sure that kids are going to be taught how to read in school. And I think most schools, most teachers think they're teaching kids to read. But what I figured out, what I started to understand is that there's this huge body of scientific research, which you just referred to, on reading, like how it works, what kids need to learn to become good readers, why many kids struggle to learn to read. And schools and teachers in the US didn't, for the most part, know about this research. So, what I started to try to figure out is why. And it has to do with deeply held beliefs about reading and how it works. And I think a deeply held belief that kids don't need to be explicitly taught very much about how written language works, especially if they do already have a lot of experience with language and with print, with the English language, for example, and that they will pretty much figure it out with like a little bit of instruction in school and a whole lot of access to books. But that isn't the case for a whole lot of kids. It doesn't have to do with intelligence, right? There are a lot of really smart people with plenty of access to books who do not learn how to read unless they're explicitly taught how to do it. So, to make a long story short, I ended up digging into all of this research, reading thousands of pages of books and articles and studies. I've never been so grateful for my own reading skill. I talked to a bunch of the scientists who had done this pioneering work over the past several decades, and I ended up really realizing that there is this idea that reading instruction in America tends to be based on, and there's variation from school to school for sure. Like there's local control in this country. That's a really fundamental idea. It means that at the end of the day, individual schools and even individual teachers are actually in many ways left to make a lot of decisions on their own about how they teach reading and how. So there are a lot of different programs. There's a lot of different materials in use. But what I started to realize is there is this idea about how to teach beginning readers that you will find in a lot of the programs and materials in a lot of classrooms. And it's this idea that Soul to Story focuses on. So the idea is that beginning readers don't have to be taught how to sound out written words because you can teach them all these other strategies to figure out the words. You can teach them to do things like look at the first letter, look at the picture, think of a word that makes sense. And the idea here is they can sound out the word, like they get some little bit of phonics instruction, and that's one thing they can do, but they don't have to sound out the word because they can use these other strategies too. And at the end of the day, this idea that there's lots of ways to read the words ends up justifying reading instruction that at one point really had very little phonics at all and has had more and more phonics, but sort of just a little bit, like maybe sprinkling here and there, not necessarily really thought through, not in a systematic, really explicit way. And this is a problem because what the cognitive scientists have shown over the past several decades is that you cannot be a good reader without being good at sounding out written words. It's not the only thing you need to be able to do to be a good reader. And but teaching beginning readers all these other strategies is a really bad idea because it takes their eyes and their focus away from sounding out the words and sounding out the words slowly, laboriously, kind of painfully at first for many kids, right? This is how you as a reader end up storing the written form of a word in your memory. You connect the pronunciation, the spelling, and the meaning of the word, and that word gets mapped into your memory. And this is really a key to being a good reader, is that you are very automatic with the words and you don't have to use your brain power to figure out the words. You use your brain power to figure out the meaning of what you're reading, which is the goal, of course, right? To be able to understand what you read. But all over the United States, kids were not being taught what they needed to know about how written English works to be able to become good readers. Some kids didn't need much instruction. I think I was one of those kids. I think my kids were those kids, right? Or this is another big part of it. Kids are lucky enough to have parents who teach them at home or hire tutors or even send them to specialized private schools to help them learn what they're not being taught in school. But a lot of kids in this very rich country of the United States, they're not so lucky to have the backup of parents or their parents' paychecks. They are depending, here in the United States, many kids are depending on school to teach them how to read. And in many schools, they are not or they were not getting the instruction that they needed. So that is essentially what I have figured out about reading in US schools. And there's a lot of change going on. There's a big reckoning going on right now here in the United States where a lot of people are a lot of teachers, a lot of school leaders, a lot of politicians are recognizing that a lot of kids haven't been getting what they need in school.
Yeah, it's an amazing overview, Emily. Thank you so much for helping us kick things off. And Ben, I know obviously you started your career in the U.S. education space, but have spent the better part of the last 2 decades working across Africa on early literacy and numeracy education reform. What help us sort of bridge this conversation a little bit. What does the journey of learning to read look like in low-income countries?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin, and hi, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, representing the Gates Foundation on this important topic. Look, let me give you a quick idea of what the predominant instructional method looks like in many sub-Saharan African countries. So, we're going to learn how to read this word, cup. Cup. The word is cup. So, if I was teaching you in the typical pre-2015 way, we would point to the word. By the way, I had the word written on the board behind me, CUP behind me. The kids would have no eyes on text. They'd be looking at the front of the word. I would point to the word and say the word is cup. This is a cup. Say after me. The word is cup. And we'd repeat it. Maybe I'd have boys say it first and then girls say it first. We'd point maybe at the word on the board. We'd point to the object. This is the look and say method. It's predominant in a lot of countries. Now, some of the other methods that prevail are similar to what Emily talks about in her podcast and what she said so far. But the basic points to here are that there's not an explicit connection between the word and the written form. And more specifically, there's often no connection between the specific sounds that each letter makes. And in addition, most curricula in the countries we worry about, the global education team at the Gates Foundation is focused on sub-Saharan Africa and India. So most curricula in those countries are focused on content in these literacy programs. By that I mean they're using a thematic approach. So my job as a teacher is to teach kids things they need to know, moving from the known to the unknown. So I start off teaching them about the family, the home, then the community and the school. So it's concentric circles expanding from what a child would understand. Now, this is a smart idea conceptually, but an inefficient idea from a reading point of view because it's inefficient to decode some of the words that might be taught early on in that kind of thematic approach. For example, the word grandmother is a word that I need to understand and be able to know the meaning of from this thematic approach very early in the family or the home. But that's quite a difficult word to decode for a grade one child, particularly in English. Think about the word niece. Knowing the word niece, that I am a niece, is important conceptually, but even harder to decode. Anybody who's thinking about kind of building scaffolding skills wouldn't introduce the word niece very early, but some countries might have the word niece in a grade one textbook. And consider these problems are exacerbated because for so many children, as Caitlin said, these words are written in a second language. So it's not only do I not know how to decode NIECE, but even if I did decode it, I wouldn't have the vocabulary that would ping me as to what that word meant when I read it. Oral language skills are there. Now, unlike the US, we have some advantages. Many, I won't quite say most, many African languages in particular have transparent orthographies. That means in a Luganda in Uganda or a Kiswahili in East Africa, the letter U consistently makes the same sound, oo, whether it's the beginning of the word, end of the word. And that's not the case in English or French, but many of these languages are quite consistent orthographically. The end result for these kids is that they're struggling to decode words in their first language as well as the second language, and they often don't have the oral language vocabulary they need to make meaning. And then here's the stat that'll blow your mind actually, that the estimated 7 in 10 children, for those of you who are not hearing the statistic all the time, 7 in 10 kids worldwide can't read at the age of grade 3. And in where I currently am and where I'm based in sub-Saharan Africa, that's 9 in 10 children. 90% of kids can't read by the end of their third grade year, age 10 year. So learning levels in these foundational years have lasting impacts on children's low learning trajectories and future life prospects overall. So this is where phonics programs come in, and the research on phonics has come in our sector for a while. We actually have decades of research worldwide demonstrating that phonics works, and in the parts of the world that Caitlin and I and others on the call are worried about, we actually have quite a bit of evidence that phonics can be an important component. That, hear me carefully, it's not the only thing that these effective programs do, but phonics are an important component of effective interventions over the last decade plus years. Let me just be really simple. I have seen kids from all types, backgrounds, language groups, and poverty levels who are actually able to read. And these programs have worked at scale and often in government systems, and sometimes fantastically quickly when they're taught letters and taught that letters make words and that these sounds come together to make words, so that this is a key part of instruction on a daily basis. Let me just give you an idea of what this might look like and how phonics as a part of the program could help. This, I'll speak to a program I know well in Kenya. In this program in Kenya called Tusome, done by the government of Kenya starting in 2015, every day kids had opportunities to play around with sounds orally, phonemic awareness for the nerds in the room. Every day, kids had opportunities to practice letter sounds and the relationship between a letter and a sound. Every day in this particular country and many others, they also practice syllables, since that's the core word part of Kiswahili and many other Bantu languages, where it's that consonant vowel blend. It's a CVCV language. Sorry, CVCV language, yeah. Every day, these kids would practice word attack skills, putting words together, often to syllable level. They practice reading stories, connected text. And critically, they practice comprehension activities all over the way in different methods. And they practice writing. So these sort of programs that would do this every day have really had an impact. And I've spent a lot of time in classrooms in Sub-Saharan Africa and India in the last 16 years, having lived here. And the truth is, well-designed programs where teachers are trained and supported to teach these kind of programs that are not only phonics, but include phonics. You see the magic of having these kids track with their fingers as their teacher is reading the word and actually seeing the relationship themselves between the letter sounds and the words. We've seen programs in Uganda. I don't know if there's Ugandans in the call, work in 12 different languages. Saw a program in Ghana make substantial impacts in many languages. In India, this program in Kenya, we talked about doubled learning outcomes at a national level on average. And actually, Emily, for you as a US-based researcher and journalist, compared to the US, actually program outcomes in some of these interventions are twice as high for programs that are also substantially higher, so essentially larger and more cost effective. I'll say this and turn back to Caitlin. If Sold a Story has made the case to the US public that phonics should be included in evidence-based programs, this case should be even stronger in many low and middle income countries, particularly countries that use alphabetic scripts, because it's quite simple with some practice to get kids knowing the relationship between letters and sounds. I see people on the call who are supporting teaching at the right level programs, people on the call who are supporting structured pedagogy programs. Both of those are teaching letter sounds as part of a larger intervention set. It's not the only thing that they do, but an important part of it. One caveat, and then will turn it back to Caitlin, is that I live and work in Ethiopia, so I have to give Ethiopia as a counterexample. Amharic, the main language there, is alpha syllabic, where each syllable is expressed in a different symbol. So it's not phonics per se that needs to be used, but it's time with these symbols. And some of these alpha syllabic languages is 200 plus symbols. Practicing them, understanding how the vowels are expressed within the symbol, getting that down is essential. So there are obviously nuances across the wide range of language groups that we're talking about. But I'll turn it back to Caitlin. Thanks.
Emily, your reflections, Ben's reflections, and so much other broader research seems to suggest that the role of phonics in learning to read is obvious. And yet, certainly in the US context, that hasn't always been an easy conclusion to accept. And what would seem to be a fairly anodyne conversation about how children learn to read has actually oftentimes become really political. Give us a sense of sort of like how has that affected the discourse, and how is that affecting progress?
Yeah, this question of how to teach kids to read has been caught up in sort of big P and little p politics for a long time, like centuries. And I think that it has sort of been able to get caught up in partisan politics. Well, just sort of briefly, the way that the politics kind of play out here in the United States is that I would say, just very broadly, generally speaking, the idea of sort of teaching letters and sounds and explicit skills that add up to being able to read was sort of seen as a kind of traditional, conservative, even Republican kind of approach. We actually had a big effort in the United States about 20 years ago, a $6 billion plus effort to try to bring what's now being called the science of reading to schools and to teachers. And that was led by a Republican administration, by President George W. Bush. So that got caught up in some very big P politics. So we do have this kind of association that there's like a right wing, like a traditional approach, which is phonics, and a more progressive liberal approach, which is focus on the meaning first, focus on immersing kids, do more of the thematic state-based stuff that Ben was talking about, for example. And I think that all of that was sort of able to be at various times kind of consumed or subsumed by politics, because a lot of people didn't understand how kids learn to read. So it sort of can be ideological if you don't know the why, which is why it's not really why, but one of the things that I've really tried to do in my work over the past 6 years now is just explain some key concepts about how do we read? How does the brain learn to do that? What do you need to know? What has been discovered about that? Because the truth is we didn't know for a long time, and we've started to really know answers to those questions over the past 50 years. And so I think it's harder for it to be political now, because when people understand the reason why, sort of tossing it off by like, well, that's not my politics, is harder to justify if you understand how critical it is. And I'll say this about partisan politics. I worry all the time, anytime policy starts getting made. Right now, there's a lot of laws being passed in the United States to try to get schools to comply more, to line their instruction up more with evidence. Anytime you start making policy and laws, it is at risk of getting consumed by politics, right? I sort of find solace in looking at my social media feeds and seeing that there are people on the far right, the far left, and everywhere in between who are really committed to this issue. And I think they're really committed to it because many of them have a personal experience. If you're a mom of a kid who's struggling to read, whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a Democrat or Republican, you still care about this issue. So I feel like that's going to kind of moderate this one, I hope, going forward, is that if the right tries to take it, the left is going to be like, no, that's my issue too. And if the left tries to take it, the right's going to be like, no, that's my issue too. And I'm hoping that means we will start to get the politics out and just do what we know is best from a lot of scientific research about how to teach kids to read.
I'm thrilled you're giving us a note of optimism as we move forward.
I don't always feel optimistic, but it's a beautiful day. I'm going to feel optimistic today.
I just want to take a moment to welcome all of the folks who've joined our session. I am in dialogue with Emily Hanford and Dr. Benjamin Piper about the role of phonics in instruction within the US and around the world. And I want to invite everyone to go ahead and please do pop your questions into the chat. I'm going to keep one more question for myself as moderator prerogative. But after that, we're going to open it up, and really keen to get the outside questions in as well. So, I mean, Ben, Emily talked a bit about how these politics have played out in the US context. For the most part, I think I'm like slightly more optimistic about our chances of advancing phonics-based education globally. But that is not to say that the topic is without debate. And I know certainly a sort of potential debate that started to emerge has been this question of, is there a trade-off between focusing on foundational literacy, focus on teaching children to read, and say focusing on their socio-emotional development? And in an environment of limited resources with hard trade-offs and an even shorter school day than we typically have in an American school context, are there hard trade-offs between the sort of emotional development of children and the academic development? And I'd love to turn this to both of you, but Ben, I'm going to invite you to jump in first if you can.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I think one of the encouraging things on this is that the countries that have reformed their curricula most recently have included social emotional skills as part of their curricula, and then often embedded in subject areas. And that's probably the case for many of the countries, or if not most of the countries that have had recent curricular reform, at least that I'm aware of. As a result, the skills that would be called social emotional are integrated into the learning standards for particular grades and subjects, often in the literacy or language subjects for a country. So as a result, what you'll see is that the stories in a program that we've talked about that's kind of includes phonics, but makes sure that kids have opportunities to do comprehension and read on a daily basis. The stories that are developed that would kind of be decodable, right? So let's say, you know, Emily talked about P, little P, big P for politics. But let's just today is the P day, and we have the lesson would include P as kind of the oral sound we're practicing, and P they were introducing, and we're thinking about words with the letter P, and we're practicing in each individual task with P. You're doing syllables that have pa and po and poo, etc. You get to the story. The story today is about P. And so maybe the story would include ideas like, oh, let's pull together. So the idea of collaboration that's part of the social emotional learning curriculum embedded in the language. Today's the P day. The story on P would include the idea of pull together, or passion and curiosity, or Pan-African, right? Or that you wear a pin to represent the community, and the kind of main character is a pig, just to make it work, right? So the phonics lesson would teach the word pig, but the pig would be in a story where they had to come together, pull together with his friends, and he's learning the power of passion and curiosity. So it's reinforcing the p sound. It's reinforcing a vocabulary that happens to start with P, but the comprehension questions and discussion that the teacher leads will focus on these core social emotional learning skills of curiosity and collaboration. But what's different is that this child who's taught using this effective phonics-based intervention or phonics-based approach has the scaffold of support, so that when they get to the P words, the teacher is helping them to pull out the initial sound and see where that letter P is, and see the relationship between P and when they switch from pin to pan as part of the activity. So the Gates Foundation follows the evidence, and in this case, the evidence is really strong. We actually know how to improve foundational learning at scale in government systems, and I think there was a recent report, Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel report, that talked about how to do that at scale. And then, as I said earlier, in this context, SEL has been integrated as part of the curriculum. And we think as a foundation that these SEL skills make sense to be embedded in literacy programs. But I do want to think it's important to say that the evidence for implementing standalone SEL programs at scale in low and middle income countries is substantially weaker. And I think to the extent that countries that are embedding these ideas into their programs should make sure that the interventions that they're using to teach these skills are part of a broader instructional improvement program that would teach kids the skills they need to be able to code, as well as comprehend, as well as to pull together, as well as to be curious as they grow. Thanks, Caitlin.
And Emily, have you seen this trade-off in the U.S., this thought that there's a sort of tension between, emotional development and learning?
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear Ben talk about that. I mean, I like the way he talks about it as, not a zero-sum game. You can sort of do them together and you can integrate them. And I think I had a lot of different thoughts as he was talking. I mean, I think there's one, as people are accepting more of the importance of teaching foundational skills, and there's more of an embrace of the role of decodable books at the very beginning of learning how to read. I think one of the things that's a really important conversation is like, what's in those books, what's in those stories. One of the things we're talking about a lot in the United States is social emotional learning, but also representation, and to make sure that kids see themselves in those books. Who are the characters? What are the stories? What are the themes? I think that's a really important part, a contribution that's being made now as people are writing new decodable books. I think it's also really important to recognize that when it comes to social emotional well-being and behavior, we know that there's a very strong correlation between reading problems and social and emotional problems. And we have some really good evidence here. If you look at the chicken or egg, which comes first? Well, a lot of times reading problems lead to behavior problems. It's not the only reason, but we really do have some good evidence that this is causing children to be anxious, depressed, act out in school. So I think it's important to recognize that by teaching children better reading, you might be able to go part of the way, maybe even a pretty long way, in helping to mitigate some of the other problems that we see in US schools that are really the result of more behavioral and social and emotional issues, disengagement, dropping out of school. all of those kinds of things, I really think we could be making headway. There are no silver bullets here. These are complex things to fix and complex interactions that are always occurring for children. But really, I think if we sort of put a bright light on the foundational skills and really make sure that kids are mastering those, that allows them to experience success in school. And the one thing I would, what I've learned, and what's quite obvious when you think about it, but what I've sort of learned by talking to parents all over the place is that when a little kid goes to school here in the United States or anywhere in the world at the age of 5 or 6 or 7, they know that one of the first tasks before them is to learn how to read, as well as to participate and learn how to behave and sit next to other kids and make friends and all of that. But they know that the main thing that they're being asked to learn how to do is learn how to read. And when that goes off the rails right away, like it does for a lot of kids, that is not good in terms of their relationship to the school, their ability to learn. Everybody wants to learn. All kids want to learn how to read, but some kids shut down pretty early when it's difficult and they're not getting the help they need, and it looks like they don't want to. But they really do. So you've got a big conversation going on in the United States now is how to work with the kids who are already in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and beyond, who are behind in reading. And so often the first thing that you've got to work with that kid is on the emotional issues that have come as a result of that. That is really important. That's what lots of people tell me is you've got to highlight that, acknowledge it, and help the kid with that, or they're not going to be open to this learning how to read. And if you're going to tell them, finally, I am going to teach you how to read, well, gosh darn it, make sure you know how to do that. Those kids have been failed so many times before. So if you tell a kid you're going to teach them how to read, teach them how to read.
Yeah, I think that's that refrain of sort of returning to what is the central promise of education and are we making good on that, I think is so fundamental here. And, for our work at Luminos, about half the kids in our class have never been to school before, but a good half of them started school, struggled to learn, and essentially were pulled out by their parents. And so we think pretty intentionally about self-concept and self-identity and what does it take to help young people think of themselves as successful students. And what we find time and time again in our own work at Luminos is that the most important thing that we can do for kids is not to tell them that they're clever, but to show them that they're clever, right?
Yeah.
And to help them learn an enormous amount in a short period of time. And nothing is as indelible as that, as the child's own learning journey in terms of changing how they think about what's possible for themselves. So we have an incredibly rich chat going, and I won't possibly do it justice. But I saw a great question from Dustin Allen a while back, which was really about the question of okay, but what does it take to support teachers to do this kind of instruction effectively? And I think that's been a live, active question, both in the US and in the global context. And so I'd love to sort of put that to both of you, and I'll let you decide who takes that one up first. But what does teacher support need to look like for implementing a phonics-based approach to literacy?
Why don't you go first, Ben?
Okay, sure. You got a word in first, so I'll go first. That sounds good.
Okay. I assigned you.
I'll go back to my first job out of university where I was a 4th grade teacher. And my job was in the inner city, and I was really overwhelmed. And I'll just go back to what I think made me at least decent at my job at teaching reading, where I had a set of materials, a lesson plan that was organized in the 4 blocks method. Actually, I was lucky because my college professor who taught me how to teach reading was the professor for this 4 blocks method. And regardless of what it means, it's just a structured approach to teaching literacy. So we had some phonics time, we had some read aloud time, we had some story time, and some comprehension time. And so even though I had some of that kind of training in my pre-service setup, I fundamentally had a lesson plan that would help me on a daily basis to figure out for my kids and for this content how to teach. And I think that's what a lot of the programs that I'm aware of have provided to teachers, some scaffolded support to allow them to teach. Obviously, as a 4th grade teacher, I had a lot of energy and I went beyond it and I was creative and I made new things to kind of emphasize core points, but actually having a well thought through program that would, on this day, give me my P, right? I was teaching the kids the P words. And then I didn't have to do the big spreadsheet analysis to figure out what day was the R day. That the program helped me do that. I was able to focus my attention on teaching that particular lesson well and making sure I had prepped that work well. So I think, fortunately, a lot of the evidence for these large scale literacy improvement programs, whether they're structured pedagogy or teaching right level 2 kind of buzzwords for international work on this topic, they do provide some support to teachers on how to do that well. But I think it's really important, Caitlin, to add to that some teacher support, some follow-up to the teacher to give them feedback on when they did that well. I taught in a Title I school in the US. I didn't see anybody else give me feedback for a good 9 months. And they visited for 5 minutes and said, "Oh, Ben, you're energetic. Good job." I did not get the support I needed on the complexity of the word attack skills, blending, segmenting, the particularities of how to teach these mini lesson routines effectively is what I needed. And I think what's exciting about some of the international evidence is that programs are trying to include structured teacher support on top of the lesson support for these phonics-based programs, because it's quite difficult. Each teacher has particular things they're good at. I was talking with a colleague today about, some teaching at the level of the child program that was supposed to teach both segmenting and blending, but happened to be in that particular training, they only did the segmenting lesson, which is to kind of pull the letter sounds apart, and didn't do the blending activity, which is to push the letter sounds together. And that kind of lack of scaffolded support to the teacher meant that they probably didn't do that particular lesson for those kids as well as they could. So I would, in conclusion, Caitlin, say that I think it's the combination of some scaffolded support that would help me have the kind of like big spreadsheet of all the things these kids need in my lap, in my hands, and add that to kind of some really focused classroom-based instructional support that gave me feedback on what to do. Thanks.
I'll just add to that really quickly that I think part of the sort of little p politics of all of this in the United States has to do with this question of sort of whether or not teachers are making their own lessons and sort of on their own, or whether they're following a prescribed program. And I think there's often a very straw man kind of like sense that is sort of made up of what the extremes are on those sides. But I do think there's been a certain amount of resistance to the idea of following a curriculum in the United States. And because there really has been sort of an idea that teachers are supposed to be making up a lot of this on their own. And one of the things that I hear from teachers who recognize how little they have been taught, how little they know about how to teach reading, it's very hard to figure out on your own how to do that when you don't really know exactly what you're supposed to teach, or maybe you yourself don't even understand the sort of written English because you're good at using it, but it doesn't mean you know what you need to know to teach it to another person, to teach it to a little kid. So I think many teachers are recognizing like this can be a real help to me. Not only can I do it sort of more effectively and more efficiently in someone who's looked at how to put together a scope and a sequence, but maybe I don't have to spend my whole weekend lesson planning. Like I can really like rely on a curriculum to help me. And it doesn't mean that teachers become automatrons or robots, but many teachers are recognizing that they themselves don't have the knowledge about written English to be able to teach it well to kids. And a good program can just really be an assist to them. So I think there's really two things teachers in the United States who weren't taught very much about how to teach reading need to understand the sort of how kids learn to read and why teaching them explicitly is so important. And number two, they really need help in how to do it. So they need good materials, good coaching, good support. And many teachers are getting that, and many other teachers are not, and they need it.
I think that's a fantastic rundown. And Ben, there's one question that's come through that we haven't touched on yet at all. So I want to make sure I give you a moment or two on this before we have to wrap. But a question from Meg on the role of assessment, right? Part of the challenge with catching children before they fall behind is that in most school systems, any kind of formal assessment begins many, many years into the journey. And even in the US context, you wouldn't really get a dipstick until third grade. So how do you think about the role of assessment in taking a phonics-based approach to literacy?
Yeah, I think there's a couple points I'd like to make about that. Point number one, it's not exactly Meg's question, but I think it's worth noting. There's a real gap in the broader national education assessment world where a lot of countries don't have current or comparable trend data to see where they stand from a learning outcomes point of view. I was just on the last week's release of the Pearls data for South Africa. It's the only African country that participated, Egypt, only Sub-Saharan African country that participated. And being able to have, as sad as it was, being able to have trend data to say, okay, compared to 2016, learning outcomes in 2021 are substantially lower, heartbreakingly lower, 5-alarm fire lower, is important. And I know there's a lot of partners on the call who are working with governments to help them expand, support the assessment structures that would allow them to be able to compare over time and then within country geographically. Now, second point is just to say that there's a good bit of evidence, and one of our partners has worked on this over the last couple of years on this idea of assessment-informed instruction. What are the light touch ways that we could support a teacher to do something similar to what I did as a fourth grade teacher? I distinctly remember my running records. Every 2 weeks, I was supposed to poll each of my kids and do a quick fluency assessment to keep track of where each individual child was. I'm really embarrassed to admit this in front of everybody on the call, but I don't think I did my running records for every kid every 2 weeks. But if we could reduce the kind of level of rigidity that some of these sort of assessment approaches make teachers feel overwhelmed by, and have it be light touch, you could truly have teachers with the availability of data they need to adjust their instruction. To Emily's point about not having teachers be robots, not having them be automatons, it's really important to know where my kids are, so that even as I have this kind of scaffolded support to help me teach, if a lot of my kids are struggling with decoding P, let me not just skip P and say, oh, P's too hard, I should reteach P. And so this idea of assessment-informed instruction means that you can do simple things like ticket out the door. I love ticket out the door. It's my favorite thing as a fourth grade teacher. I was teaching the letter P, and at the end of the lesson, before the kid went to recess or before they went to lunch, I would have them do a quick alphabetic principle practice word with me as they left the classroom. What's the first word in this? And what's the first sound in the word pan? And you ask them to segment the word pan. Something simple to see individually at the child level whether or not the kids have learned the basic idea. And that was much easier for me to do because it didn't require a lot of prep. It didn't have a lot of writing. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't keep track of all my running records all the time. So not having teachers always assume that this kind of assessment informed instruction requires a ton of work, but it's a really simple way for me to have a quick check of whether or not I need to reteach or if I can go ahead and skip to the next lesson. Thanks.
I think that's so spot on, Ben. And the power of when we empower teachers to do simple classroom level check-ins is that we're actually giving them a way to see each child as an individual. And so when we talk about classroom-based assessment at Luminos, we talk about it very much from that lens. Everyone wants to meet children where they are, and assessment is the fundamental piece of the puzzle to make that happen. Well, gosh, it feels like we are just getting started in this conversation today, and I can see from the liveliness of the chat that my hope and aspiration is that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. The spark that Emily has lit in the phonics conversation in the U.S. context, let that burn bright across the globe. I am so grateful to have had Emily Hanford and Ben Piper with us today for this session. Invite everyone to continue to follow Luminos online and do take a look at our phonics for first generation readers. We look forward to following up with all of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.